January 2018. Two climbers stand on the summit of Nanga Parbat in complete darkness. The temperature is -50. One of them has just become the first woman to conquer this mountain in winter. The second is blind. The countdown to catastrophe begins. But to understand how they ended up there, we have to go back to the distant past. Tomasz Mickiewicz was born in 1975 in the small Polish town of Jaloszyn. He spent the first decade of his life with his sister at his grandmother's, in a quiet place on the banks of the Rutty River. It was there, amidst the fields and forests, that his craving for nature awakened within him, a craving that would never leave him. At the age of 10, his family moved. Tomasz longed for the village, for open spaces, for freedom. This longing became deeply ingrained. It became a part of him, inseparable, like a scar. The 90s met him as a teenager and pulled him into a whirlpool. First, he started sniffing glue. The chemical smell burned his nostrils, blurring the boundaries of reality. Then he moved on to something more serious. Soon, home stopped being a refuge for him. Tomasz left for the streets. His sister Agnieszka found him and took him to a rehabilitation center. 3 months later, he was back where he had been pulled from, as if an invisible hand was pulling him towards the edge. Rehabilitation again, this time with occupational therapy. For 2 years he dug trenches, carried sacks at construction sites, loaded wagons. Calluses on his palms burst and grew back again. His back ached in the evenings. But somewhere in this monotonous pain, there was a foothold. And he managed to get out. After moving to Warsaw, he met a girl named Joanna. Eventually, he got married. Life seemed to be getting back on track. But friends recall, there was still an emptiness inside him, a feeling that something was missing. As if there was a gaping hole inside that needed to be filled with something. Every day, again and again. Tomasz started searching. He enrolled in philosophy at Warsaw University. Lectures, notes, endless debates in classrooms. And dropped out after a few months. Words didn't fill the void. He decided to hitchhike to India. He spent a whole year there. The dust of the roads, the smell of spices, the heat that melted asphalt. And there, for the first time, he saw the Himalayas. White peaks on the horizon, so distant they seemed painted, so high that looking at them was painful. His neck grew stiff, and something constricted in his chest. It was then that he realized he wanted to pursue high-altitude mountaineering. Tomasz and Joanna moved to Ireland. She found work as a child psychologist. He got a job as a mechanic. His hands smelled of machine oil, dirt ingrained under his fingernails that no soap could wash away. In 2008, at a garden party, he met Marek Namowski, a fellow countryman and climber. Marek recalls, "I was talking about how I tried to climb Mount Logan in Canada alone. Tomasz unexpectedly declared that he would go with me next time. He eagerly started climbing the local rocks. He climbed better than me and learned everything himself, without courses, without schools. He had a talent." Tomasz kept his word. In May 2008, they went to Canada. They climbed Mount Logan and from the summit rafted straight into the ocean. The expedition lasted 70 days and brought them recognition. His muscles ached so much that Tomasz woke up at night with calf cramps. The skin on his face peeled from the wind and sun, but it was the right kind of pain. A year later, Tomasz soloed Khan Tengri, 7,010 meters, successfully. Solitude at altitude is a unique state. No one will back you up. No one will pull you out if something goes wrong. Just you, the mountain, and the thin line between life and falling. And then his gaze fell upon Nanga Parbat, the 9th highest peak in the world, one of the most challenging 8,000ers. It is called the Killer Mountain. Its mortality rate is one of the highest among Himalayan giants. But Tomasz fell in love with it specifically. He called Marek, suggesting they attempt a winter ascent. It was an incredibly ambitious idea. At that time, there had been no winter ascents of Nanga Parbat. It would have been a record. But, to be honest, they had neither the experience, the equipment, nor the training for such a feat. Marek Nowski recalls that several factors attracted them. Firstly, the mountain's fame and the possibility of a record. Secondly, its relative accessibility. It was only a 2-day approach to the Diamir face. And thirdly, the climbing permit cost only $300. Compared to Everest, where a permit costs tens of thousands and the entire expedition rarely comes in under 50,000, here, a prestigious peak for pennies. However, among climbers, it has another name, the Killer. Marek recounts, "To save on porters, we carried all the gear to base camp ourselves. We didn't have proper equipment. Jackets, tents, sleeping bags, everything was for tourism, not for winter ascents of 8,000ers. We were so different from other expeditions that even locals from the Pakistani village at the foot of the mountain didn't believe we were going for the summit. The backpacks weighed on their shoulders so much that the straps dug into their bones. Every step was an effort. Rocks crumbled underfoot, ankles turned on uneven ground. By evening, their legs throbbed and their backs shot with pain. Locals looked at them with pity or with bewilderment." They didn't reach the summit that time. They returned the following year. The equipment was slightly better, their experience a little more. They reached 5,480 meters, but 8,000 meters was still very far away. The thin air already pressed on their temples. Their breathing became ragged. Their hearts pounded like those of a spent horse. A year later, Tomasz reached an altitude of 7,315 meters on the Messino Ridge, but again, not the summit. The wind at that altitude tore at his clothes, seeped into every crevice, sucked the warmth from his body. His fingers went numb even in gloves. Having spent all their money on the expedition, they had to sell their gear to buy tickets home. By 2015, Marek decided he was done with mountains. His body wasn't what it used to be, and the risk didn't justify the outcome. But Tomasz wasn't going to give up. When Marek left, Tomasz decided now he would climb alone, in alpine style, fast, with minimal gear, without multiple camps, and most often without oxygen. It was a dangerous way to ascend. It allowed no room for error. One wrong move, one misstep, and the mountain would not forgive. And then he met Elisabeth Revol, a rising star of the French climbing team. Elisabeth was 5 years younger than Tomasz, and his complete opposite. He was talkative, eccentric, an anarchist at heart. He could talk for hours, jumping from topic to topic, gesticulating, laughing loudly. She was a quiet PE teacher from a small town. She chose her words carefully, spoke softly, almost in a whisper. He was a former drug addict who had gone through the hell of addiction and rehabilitation. She didn't drink alcohol and avoided gluten, monitoring her diet with an athlete's discipline. But opposites attract. As a child, Elizabeth did gymnastics, stretching to the point of pain, splits on the cold gym floor, calluses on her palms from the horizontal bar. At 19, her parents suggested she try climbing, and there she found her calling. In 2006, she went on a French expedition to the Bolivian Andes. She returned with 9 summits, 5 of which she was the first to ascend. Then she went to Pakistan. She conquered 3 8,000ers, Broad Peak, Gasherbrum I, and Gasherbrum II, all 3 without oxygen, in 16 days. This was an almost impossible pace. The body doesn't have time to recover. Every step at such an altitude is a battle with one's own body, which screams, "Stop, go back down, immediately." In April 2012, Elizabeth set off for Annapurna with her Czech partner, Martin Minarik. They reached the east summit, but couldn't ascend to the main summit due to hurricane-force winds. Gusts knocked them off their feet. Snow lashed their faces like tiny needles. Visibility dropped to 0. During the descent, Martin went missing. His body was never found. Elizabeth descended to base camp with severe frostbite, exhausted. Her fingers had turned black, her skin peeled, her lips cracked until they bled. She received first aid and was evacuated to a Kathmandu hospital. The loss of her partner hit her terribly. The guilt wouldn't let go. Perhaps she should have insisted on returning earlier. Perhaps she had missed something. She gave up mountaineering for 4 years. But in 2013, she decided to return. She chose Nanga Parbat for her ascent. She didn't reach the summit then, but she returned 2 years later and teamed up with Tomasz. Elizabeth recalls, "I really enjoyed our climb together. We talked a lot, had a great time." That year, they reached an altitude of 7,800 meters, already close to the death zone, where oxygen is so scarce that the brain begins to fail. Thoughts become muddled, decisions are made on autopilot. They teamed up for another attempt in the winter of 2016, but bad weather forced them to turn back. A blizzard engulfed the mountain, such that visibility dropped to a meter. To continue would have been suicide. For Tomasz, this was already his 6th winter ascent attempt. Before leaving, he told a Polish journalist that this was his last attempt. He would not return to Nanga Parbat again. On February 26, 2016, Simone Moro, Alex Tricon, and Mohammed Ali Sadpara became the first climbers to ascend Nanga Parbat in winter. The record Tomasz had dreamed of was lost. The Pole even tried to dispute their achievement. He demanded more photos from the summit, GPS data. He scrutinized every frame, every detail. He looked for a catch, an inconsistency, any reason to doubt. But the record was recognized. Tomasz never acknowledged this. Deep down, he knew. They were first, and he was late. And then he turned to Elizabeth. He said he wanted to try one more time, that he felt a connection to this mountain, that he had to finish with it once and for all, to close this gestalt, otherwise it would haunt him for the rest of his days, and that he was sure this attempt would be successful. Almost sure. They arrived at base camp on December 23, 2017. For Tomasz, this was his 7th attempt at the ascent, a number with a taste of finality. For Elizabeth, her 4th. On January 21, even before dawn, they broke camp and headed for the summit. The darkness was absolute. Headlamps tore circles of light from it. A few meters ahead, no more. Beyond that, blackness. Breaths escaped in clouds of vapor, instantly freezing on their jackets as a thin crust of frost. Their boots crunched on the crust. The ascent was very slow. At this altitude, every step was like climbing stairs with a heavy sack on one's back. Lungs burned, hearts hammered against ribs, muscles filled with lead. Only an hour of daylight remained until sunset. But they weren't going to turn back. They had to finish what they started. 7 times. 7 attempts. The last one. The shadows of the Himalayan peaks lengthened with each passing second, covering the valleys in darkness. The air became so cold that every breath caused pain. Icy needles pierced their throats, their lungs settling on the walls of their bronchi. Elizabeth Revol, a 38-year-old French alpinist with 4 8,000ers to her name, took several photographs before the final push to the summit. Her fingers barely obeyed, even in gloves. For a second, the shot lingered on her partner, Tomasz Makiek, who had been obsessed with Nanga Parbat for 10 years. He had never attempted to climb any other 8,000er, and for a mountain, that's a great distance. Obsession, it either liberates or kills. It was clear he was running out of strength. His steps slowed. His movements became mechanical, automatic. His eyes stared through, as if his focus had shifted and wouldn't return. Elizabeth put away her camera, took out her navigator. The screen glowed pale green in the twilight. Only 100 vertical meters remained to become the first woman to ascend Nanga Parbat in winter. 100 meters. On flat ground, it's nothing. Here, an eternity. The weather was calm. There was almost no wind. For such an altitude, it was relatively warm, -30 instead of the usual 50. But everything would change as soon as the sun set. The climbers understood this perfectly. The wind would pick up. It always intensifies after sunset. The temperature would drop to -50. They had to hurry. She waited for Tomasz. He walked slowly, placing his feet cautiously, as if testing every centimeter of the slope. They went towards the summit together. Elizabeth would later tell a Polish TV channel that they reached the 8,126-meter summit together at dusk. The sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, but the sky still held the last shades of light: purple, dark blue, almost black. She became the first woman to make a winter ascent of Nanga Parbat. Tomasz, the first Polish climber to do so. Not such a resounding record, but a record nonetheless. Once on the summit, they took several pictures. Their hands trembled from the cold, from exhaustion, from emotion, but there was no time to savor the triumph. Besides, the Pole looked exhausted. His face was gray, his lips blue, his gaze hazy. Elizabeth asked Tomasz how he felt. He replied that he couldn't see anything. Elizabeth knew. Blindness is one of the symptoms of acute mountain sickness. Most likely, the Pole had developed cerebral edema. Fluid accumulates in the skull, presses on tissues, disrupts blood circulation. If he wasn't immediately brought down to a lower altitude where he could get more oxygen, it would lead to death. Quick or slow, it didn't matter. They had climbed without supplemental oxygen, in alpine style. But Tomasz had spent all his strength on the ascent. On the descent, he moved slower and slower. His legs buckled, his balance wavered. Elizabeth placed his hand on her shoulder and began to lead her blinded partner down. Every step required control. Where to place his foot, how to distribute weight, how not to stumble on a rock. When they reached an altitude of 7,895 meters, just below the so-called death zone, Tomasz began to have breathing difficulties. Wheezing, gurgling in his chest, convulsive breaths. Elizabeth removed his mask. Bright red blood flowed from his mouth. Bright, frothy, a sign of pulmonary hemorrhage. His nose and cheeks were white from frostbite. His skin was deathly pale, waxy. The bleeding was also likely a symptom of mountain sickness, which had already caused pulmonary edema. Fluid seeps into the alveoli, blocking gas exchange, and the person slowly drowns in their own blood. The climber needed to be brought down urgently. At 11 p.m., Elizabeth took out her InReach satellite device and sent a text message to 3 people: her husband, Tomasz's wife, and a friend. Her fingers barely obeyed. She had to press multiple times to hit the right button. She asked for helicopters to be sent. Friends and relatives began searching for helicopters in Pakistan. The task was difficult. Helicopters rarely fly above 6,000 meters. The thin air doesn't provide enough lift, and they were significantly higher, almost at 8,000. Meanwhile, Elizabeth helped Tomasz take shelter. She dug a snow cave to hide from the wind. She dug with an ice axe, her hands, whatever she could find. The snow was dense, compacted, yielding with difficulty. After half an hour, a small burrow gaped in the slope, barely enough room for 2. From inside the cave, she sent another message. Tomasz is in terrible condition, cannot move on his own. We are unable to pitch a tent. He needs to be evacuated urgently. The cold crept under their clothes. The wind howled outside, driving snow dust into the cracks. Tomasz lay motionless, his breathing shallow, intermittent. By coincidence, on a neighboring peak, K2, a Polish expedition was attempting a winter first ascent. It was led by the legendary Polish climber Krzysztof Wielicki, a 68-year-old veteran with 14 8,000ers to his name and a solo, oxygen-free ascent of Nanga Parbat in 1996. A man who knew this mountain, knew what it could do to a person. Wielicki recalls, "I realized the only option for Elizabeth and Tomasz was to send a rescue team from us to Nanga Parbat. I asked 13 climbers at K2 base camp, is anyone willing to interrupt their ascent to save 2 dying people? Everyone said yes. Without hesitation, without wavering. For the operation, Wielicki chose Adam Bielecki, Denis Urubko, Jacek Czech, and Yaroslav Botor, the best of the best. The helicopters were delayed, some say due to a dispute over cost between the Polish and French embassies, the Pakistani army, and the climbers' insurance company. Bureaucracy doesn't stop even when every hour counts. Ultimately, the helicopters were paid for by the relatives of the victims. They raised the money overnight. They arrived at K2 base camp only at 1 p.m. on January 27. They picked up 4 rescuers and headed for Nanga Parbat. The helicopters flew low over the glaciers, skirting the peaks. The blades whipped up snow dust, and visibility fluctuated from 0 to 100 meters. Finding the mountain, not to mention a landing spot, was not easy. The pilots had never been there. Wielicki recalls, "When we got closer, I showed them where the village was, where the base camp was, and where they could land. I also told them they looked like brave men and asked, if possible, to drop us as high as possible up the slope." The helicopters dropped off the rescuers at an altitude of 4,800 meters, just below Camp 1. It was unsafe to fly any higher. The air is too thin. The blades lose efficiency. One gust of wind and the aircraft could crash. By the way, people often ask, why aren't they rescued by helicopters? Because helicopters physically cannot safely ascend to such heights. The climbers decided Chichi and Botur would stay at the landing spot to set up camp. Bieliki and Urubko would go for the victims. They began their ascent at 5:30 p.m. It was already getting dark. It must be said, these are some of the strongest climbers of our time. 44-year-old Adam Bieliki had climbed Khan Tengri and had 19 ascents of 8,000ers. Denis Urubko, a Kazakh with a reputation as a machine, capable of going without stopping for days. The climbers were in a hurry. They traversed almost the entire route without protection. There was no time to drive in pitons, check anchors, tie knots. They didn't use a single ice screw for the entire ascent. When they saw old ropes left by other expeditions, they used them, even though that was also very dangerous. You never know how reliable a rope is. Frost destroys fibers. Ultraviolet light makes them brittle. Let me remind you, this was a winter ascent of one of the most difficult 8,000ers, at night, in a hurry. But the rescuers were well prepared, and most importantly, they were acclimatized. Their bodies had already adapted to the altitude. Their blood was saturated with hemoglobin, and their lungs worked efficiently. Tomasz and Elizabeth remained in a snow cave. Whether they descended together or had already separated and descended individually, it was unclear. Elizabeth herself couldn't remember exactly later. Time at altitude flows differently. Minutes stretch, hours compress. Denis Urubko recalls, "I started shouting, hoping that perhaps some miracle had happened and they were somewhere here. I shouted through the wind. Finally, I heard a faint voice. It was Elizabeth." The climber had suffered frostbite and was afflicted with altitude sickness. Moreover, she was alone. She sat motionless, her back pressed against the cave wall. Tomasz was nowhere to be found. Before she was found, the woman had hallucinations, also a symptom of altitude sickness. The brain, deprived of oxygen, begins to create images. Elizabeth thought someone had brought tea. The woman she hallucinated asked her to give up a boot in return. At that moment, I automatically stood up, took off my shoes, and gave them to her. And in the morning, when I woke up, I was only wearing socks, the climber recalls. The rescuers gave the woman hot tea from a thermos and tried to warm her frostbitten hands. Her fingers were wooden, white, and wouldn't bend. And, of course, they asked about Tomasz. Elizabeth said that he couldn't move or walk on his own. Therefore, she was forced to leave him in a crevasse in their makeshift camp. A little higher up the slope, maybe 100 meters, maybe 200. At this altitude, distances are deceptive. Urubko and Bieletki were faced with a very difficult choice: to reach Tomasz or bring Elizabeth down. Elizabeth could walk, with assistance, but she could. Tomasz couldn't. He would have to be carried, and carrying a person on an 8,000er in winter at night, that's almost impossible. Weight, slope, darkness, cold. Bieletki says, "We understood. If we leave Elizabeth and go for Tomasz, we will be able to bring down from the mountain a person who cannot walk on his own." A pause. Maybe a second, maybe a minute. They made a very difficult decision. They would not go for Tomasz. They would leave him to die in the mountains. At dawn, Bieletki, Urubko, and Elizabeth began their descent. The sky lightened, gray, heavy, without a hint of sun. The wind died down. The slope stretched downwards in an endless white band. The woman's hands were severely frostbitten. She could barely stand on her feet. Her legs buckled, her balance wavered. Therefore, it's more accurate to say they began to bring her down. Bielecki went ahead, breaking trail. Urubko was behind, providing backup, supporting her when she stumbled. At 11:30 a.m., approximately 18 hours after arriving at Nanga Parbat, Bielecki, Urubko, and Elizabeth reached a safe zone with the helicopters. The helicopters were waiting at the landing pad. The blades idled, kicking up snow dust. A French politician asked President Emmanuel Macron to award the rescue team the Legion of Honor, France's highest civilian award. But the rescuers refused, although they had indeed performed a heroic feat. Adam Bielecki said, "I don't think we did anything extraordinary. Anyone would have done the same in our place." The climber Elizabeth Raval suffered severe frostbite, but survived. She lost several fingers on her hands, but she is alive. Tomasz Makiewicz left behind a wife and 3 children. And he himself forever remained on the slopes of Nanga Parbat, the mountain he had tried to conquer his entire life. 7 attempts, 1 summit, and a price no one wanted to pay.